are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. Happy Halloween to those who celebrate. For today's episode, I have some not scary content in the form of an interview with Lauca. Lauca is the author of the historical fiction novel Returning East. In addition to Returning East, Lauca is a micro-story author. I'm here with Lauca. Did I pronounce that name correctly?
Yes, you did. Perfect.
Who is the author of the book Returning East. Lauca, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for having me.
Now, most of the guests for my podcast are from the United States, but you are not an American, and from what I understand, you are from Europe, correct?
That's correct. And this is why I really appreciate this chance to be on the podcast so that I can reach a wider audience. I am originally from Italy and I live in Berlin, in Germany. And even though my mother tongue is not English, I do write in English.
Okay, now feel free to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Okay, thanks. So as you said, my name is Lauca, which is basically a contraction of my first name and my family name. And I started my writing journey publishing micro stories on my website. That was May 2020. I started doing this because I wanted to build a writing practice, and therefore I committed myself to publish 2 micro stories per month, which I keep doing. And I just released a collection of micro stories for the first 2 years that I wrote them, and the book is available either for purchase or to newsletters subscribers. And as you already mentioned, I am also the author of Returning East, which is an historical novel. It is my first book, and I published it in February 2022.
Now, without spoiling too much of Returning East, what is that book about?
Yes, the book is about a journey, both in the physical sense and in the more metaphorical sense. So the physical sense is my protagonist, JJ, is not by chance a Frenchman, and he travels from Marseille, from France, to reach Hong Kong and China in 1954. And during the course of this journey, he wants to go to China to keep a promise that he made. But in the course of this journey, there are several things happening that he did not expect. And he had then to face difficulties that he never encountered before. And in the process, of course, he discovers himself. He has to face new situations, he has to find new resources within himself, and he has to face his past as well. So in this sense, it's an interior journey. The interior journey is more, let's say, in the background of the book, and the real story, is full of action and lots of things happening, and it's quite fun and enjoyable to read. So I heard from my reviewers, at least.
East Asian culture, and specifically the culture of China and British colonial era Hong Kong, inspired Returning East. How did you become interested in East Asian culture as a European, and have you ever been to any part of East Asia?
Oh, definitely. I think actually I started very young to have an interest in China. I studied languages in Italy, in what we call high school, which is, I think the school system is always a little bit different from the US. And I always wanted to learn an extra European language. And from very early on, when I was 16, I think I decided I wanted to study Chinese. So I first started studying Chinese when, as I said, I was 16, and I always said one day I will go to China. And this happened later on in 1996 was the first time I went to China, and basically I spent the next 10 years of my life busy with China. I was living there, I was working in China, studying Chinese. Later on, I also studied Chinese at the university. So this area, this culture is quite familiar to me, and this is why, in a way, I had to bring those experiences on paper. And even though the book is not my story, is not autobiographical, of course, there are lots of things, lots of impressions that I had when I was living there that are also recorded in this book in one way or the other.
Now, is your book Returning East self-published or traditionally published?
It is self-published. I decided to go this way. I did try to find an agent, but I didn't want to leave, my book just in a drawer because, it's not easy to find an agent if you're an unknown author, especially not even living in an English-speaking country. And I must say that it was a very good choice because I learned so much, and it still is a very interesting journey. So definitely something to recommend, to expand your life as well.
Now, as you mentioned a little bit earlier on in this interview, you've written numerous micro stories, which are very short stories, not more than a few hundred words in length, and shorter than a typical short story, which is a couple thousand to a few thousand words in length, typically. How does writing micro stories prepare you for writing a novel like Returning East?
I think I mentioned that I wrote and I still write micro stories in order to build this writing practice. So first of all, it taught me I really to have discipline, to set time aside to write, and to do it whether I had the inspiration or not. Because sometimes life gets so busy that when your writing slot comes, you would rather do something else because it's more important. But once I committed myself, then okay, I sit down and I write. It doesn't matter what it comes out. It can always be edited, and this is also a skill that then I could use when writing a novel, because it's the same thing. I committed myself to write this novel, so I had a certain amount of words that I wanted to accomplish each week, and I made sure that I could do it. And at the same time, of course, writing micro stories allows you to experiment with points of view, with language, and it keeps your imagination alive. So to me, they are very helpful.
Now, this is a question I didn't have written down, but while I would consider micro stories to have literary value, there might be people that don't see any literary value in micro stories. And how would you respond to someone who would say that micro stories don't have literary value?
Well, if they wanted, they can keep their opinion. That's a free word, and I'm sure there are people that will think that. To me, they can have value. I mean, it depends, of course, with which aim you write them and how you craft them. But it's not easy to have a complete story, within, very short, very few words. Actually, it's quite challenging. Sometimes it's really more challenging than having a whole short story or a whole novel written. Then, as I said, it's up to everybody. Each of us has the right to think whatever they want, whether they have a literary value or not. I think they do have some worth, definitely.
And I agree that shorter forms of fiction can have a ton of literary value.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what is your typical writing routine if you have one?
Well, as I said, I usually schedule my writing time. I try to schedule at least a couple of slots of a couple of hours per week. If I have to, if I want to write a novel or a longer piece, then it might be, I might have more slots. Usually, my writing day is Tuesday because I do not work in an office, so I can stay at home and work on my projects. Um, and then usually when I finish writing a longer things like a longer short story or in this case of course a novel, then I will put it aside for a while and write something else before I go back and edit what I've written.
Now, I had a different question written down, but since you've already answered this earlier on in the
Oh,
interview, you write in English even though English is not your primary language or your mother tongue. And let me try to think of the question I was going to ask because I don't have it written
yes.
down. Uh, how did you learn how to speak and write English?
I studied English in Italy because as I mentioned before, I went to what we call a high school, which is from age 14 to age 18, 19. And I studied English, German, and French. And I left Italy when I was 19, and I basically lived more than half of my life by now living in a foreign country, so not living in Italy. Therefore, I often had to use English for everyday's life, and very often also for my work. And especially when I was in China, for example, my Chinese at that time was not that good, and I had no access to other books in Italian or French, the languages that I could read most easily, and I had to learn to read in English. So, of course, the more you read in a language, the more you assimilate the vocabulary. And of course, I am aware that I am not perfect, but to me, languages are about communication, and and if I need the support of an English mother tongue for my books for the editing, yes, that's a good solution for me.
Yeah, and also, how easy was it for you to learn English as someone whose mother tongue is Italian?
It, English is not a difficult language per se. I mean, comparing to other languages that I learned, German is much more difficult. The grammar is a nightmare. Uh, Chinese grammar is easy, but learning how to write it and to read it is very challenging. So I think each language has its difficulties. I think English might be challenging if you really want to get to a point where you write perfectly, where you really have that high level of literature uh, kind of language. That for sure is something that it's more challenging to reach as a non-mother tongue.
Yeah, and I'm surprised that you would find German to be harder to learn than English, given that English has a ton of quirks to it, and German and English are in the same language family, Germanic.
Yeah, but German, the grammar is difficult. And even though I have been living in Germany already for over 10 years and I use German for my work every day, I still do not consider myself to be able to write a letter without any grammar mistakes. While in English, I can definitely write much better.
And I'm gonna, since I haven't really asked a personal question yet in this interview, and this is the final question I have written down. What is one interesting thing about you that most people don't know about?
Oh, that most people don't know about. Oh, I usually talk about my interesting point. Why would I hide them, actually? Um, so let me think. Something that most people don't know about. That's a challenging question. Yeah, well, I am not religious, and I am not a Christian or Buddhist or whatever, but in my home, I have a small altar to my father, who unfortunately departed in 2020, with a small Buddha statue, and so his presence keeps me company here in the privacy of my home.
Well, your dad died the same year my dad did, and I'm an atheist who keeps a Bible in my house.
Okay, yeah.
So there's a couple
Yes,
similarities there.
yes, as long as it brings comfort,
Well,
everything is fine.
Lauca, I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
I thank you for having me, Aaron. I thank you very much for your patience with all the technical problems that we had before the interview.
You're welcome.
I wish you a great day.
Lauca was a wonderful guest for our interview, and she referenced technical difficulties we had trying to get the interview recording set up at the end of the interview, so I'll briefly touch on that. It took us both several minutes to get through all sorts of audio issues before we were able to do the interview, but we got the issue sorted out. Before I sign off, I will acknowledge tragic news from South Korea. As of the recording of this segment, at least 154 people have been killed in a crowd crush during Saturday's Halloween celebration in the Itaewon neighborhood of Seoul, South Korea. The Heartland Author podcast offers condolences to the families and loved ones of those who lost their lives in the tragedy. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/author AAC. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at author AAC and on Instagram at AAC Scribe. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https:// www.zapsplat.com.